My name is Kareola. I wrote this paper that I'm presenting today as part of the Research Masters in Religious Studies at the University of Amsterdam, under supervision of my professors, Peter Forschel and Dr. Christian Greer. I also just want to thank the organizers here for having me today. So, we'll talk a lot about reframing things today and over the next couple of days, and I'll start with reframing Amanita Muscaria. When walking down the streets of Brooklyn, New York, it is not unusual to encounter improvised A signs on the pavement advertising the health benefits of Amanita Muscaria, made to lure in curious pedestrians and sell them the products inside. These signs list benefits ranging from pain relief to increased productivity, making the mushroom appear as a one-size-fits-all magic cure. Amanita Muscaria, commonly known as the fly agaric, is arguably the world's most famous mushroom, with its bright red cap and little white dots. Today, it can be legally sold, possessed, and consumed in the US and Canada. Unlike psilocybin-containing mushrooms, neither Amanita Muscaria nor its active compounds, muscimol and ibotenic acid, are scheduled under the 1970 US Controlled Substances Act. Its legal status has given rise to a market for Amanita products, from edibles like candy-flavored muscimol gummies, dessert-flavored muscimol vapes, and pre-rolls blended with hemp flower. Commercialization and commodification of psychoactive plants is not new, yet has spiked with the recent legalization of cannabis and the decriminalization of psilocybin in certain countries and US states. The question I'm concerned with today is how Amanita Muscaria is differently understood as a commodity, medicine, spirit, or companion across indigenous and Western scientific worldviews, and what the implications of these ontologies are for decolonizing psychedelic practices. I attempt to answer this through comparative analysis of a recent Amanita Muscaria product and the indigenous mushroom practices of the Lygoravetlat, a peoples native to what is today called the Siberian Beringian region, where Amanita Muscaria first appeared on Earth millions of years ago, and where these rock carvings were made around 4000 BCE. And you can see here, for those who don't know these ancient rock carvings show people with mushroom-shaped figures on their heads. The Lygoravetlat are an Arctic people who primarily inhabit the extreme northeastern part of what is known today as Siberia. Indigenous Sakha scholar Lyudmila Nikanorova emphasizes how the English word Siberia, similar to the Russian Sibir, is the colonial marker of the Russian invasion beyond the Urals. When speaking of practices that predate the Russian colonization, using the term Siberia is technically incorrect. From a decolonial perspective, more nuance is also necessary when speaking of contemporary peoples and from this area and their practices. In referring to the geographic region and its people, I will, where possible, use indigenous names. Lygoravetlat, for instance, is the indigenous name of the tribe the Russians call the Chukchi. Nikanorova also problematizes shamanism as an analytical category. She shows how the term shaman originally came from the Evenki word shaman. This was transformed into the analytical term shaman, which then developed into shamanism. This term was used by the Russians to other indigenous practitioners. Nikanorova argues that the translation and categorization of indigenous practitioners as shamans resulted not only in the exotification and dehumanization of these practitioners, but also in their imprisonment during the Soviet regime. The Lygoravetlat were one of the last groups of indigenous peoples to fall under Russian rule. They were largely ignored when the Russians first learned about them in the 1640s, as the harsh tundra they lived on was poor in fur-bearing animals sought by the Russians. However, once other sources of fur were depleted, Russia launched a series of vigorous military campaigns against the Lygoravetlat in 1729. The Lygoravetlat met them with ferocious resistance and, when they ran out of options, committed mass suicide instead of surrendering. By the 1760s, the Russian government decided that the cost of conquering the Lygoravetlat was too high in terms of money and troops and ended the war on the condition that the Lygoravetlat stop attacking Russian settlers and pay the yasak, the yearly tax that indigenous Siberians paid in furs. Folklorist Annalena Sikala, when analyzing indigenous peoples from the region, describes how the smaller tribes of the Lygoravetlat and the Koryak, as opposed to the larger tribes of the Yukagir and the Venki, showed no signs of a clear clan system. Instead, they lived in hunting communities and nomad camps consisting of relatives and neighbors. The annual occupational and other important rites were performed among family or kin, with no one person designated as a leader. In the Lygoravet language, Amanita Muscaria is called Vapak. Following their fieldwork among indigenous communities in the 1980s and 2000s, Elena Batyanova and Michael Bronstein show how the ideas around Vapak among the Lygoravetlat are based on ancient animistic beliefs, meaning that nature and the entire surrounding world is imbued with life and consciousness. Vapak is, according to these views, a living being. In interviews, those Lygoravetlat asked to explain the characteristics of Vapak described the mushroom as cheerful and good-natured, and emphasized how Vapak loves to joke about Vapak poisoned people, sometimes forcing them to sing, dance, take off their clothes, and make obscene gestures. Ethnographer Valdemar Bogoras identified 3 stages of Vapak intoxication. The first stage is characterized by a noisy gaiety, while in the second, a person sees objects in an enlarged or reduced form, or hears voices ordering him to perform certain actions, sees spirit of the mushroom, and talks to them or imitates them. In the third stage, a person, being in an unconscious state, travels to other worlds where they meet ancestors who have passed away. Especially in this latter stage, Vapak can be considered an intermediary, a living being, which provides access to worlds otherwise inaccessible. Vapak is also described by the Lygoravetlat as helping people by giving them advice, warning them of danger, curing them from illness, or punishing them for wrongdoings. The mushroom has its own spirits, and these appear to people in dreams and hallucinations, sometimes forcing those who have ingested Vapak to imitate them. As Vapak is considered an entity, it is forbidden to eat Vapak with a bad agreement. Instead, it must be treated kindly. Batyanova and Bronstein's fieldwork records how some of the interactions of several Lygoravetlat with Vapak spirits, such as cases where the spirit advises them how often to take Vapak or forbids them to eat the mushroom again in the future. They also record how many people who have taken Vapak recall a feeling of joyful excitement, the sensation of extraordinary lightness or flight. One of their interlocutors mentions how you want to talk, sing songs, and work. It's like you're walking on air. There are also some mentions of aggressive behavior caused by Vapak ingestion, but this is a rare phenomenon. 2 other ethnographers, U.E. Osherodov and A.A. Yarzutkina, show, following their recent ethnographic fieldwork in 8 villages of the Lygoravetlat between 2011 and 2020, how, especially in the northeast, of what is today called Siberia, unlike the more western part, Vapak ingestion is of a domestic nature, and how among the Lygoravetlat it is ordinary people, not necessarily the medicine people, who consume Vapak, because it is ordinary people that need help penetrating into other worlds, whereas the medicine people already have access. They also mention how Vapak's unusual strength, and how they, as mushrooms, can break through the roots of trees and even through stones. People eating Vapak become like the mushrooms and acquire their magical power and energy. It is said that over time, the Lygoravetlat learned to skillfully charge themselves with the energy accumulated in Vapak. The worldview of the Lygoravetlat is based on an understanding of the important role of the natural and supernatural forces that manifest themselves in all spheres of life. The Lygoravetlat have two concepts that define the world with all its inhabitants, the living and non-living objective world. The first is called Narginen, meaning the entire environment surrounding the earth, external space, universe, spirit of the universe, or nature. This is perceived as a divine force that is in charge of all natural phenomena, such as the elements and what depends on trees, reindeer herding, and the well-being of people. The second is Vargirgin, meaning being, life, deity, and this is understood as a supernatural force influencing the social conditions of people's lives. Osherdov and Yortsutkina argue that neither Christianity nor Soviet ideology have successfully transformed this worldview, and the Lygoravetlat perceive the world through these concepts to this day. As such, the behavior of the Lygoravetlat in various spheres of life, including Vapak ingestion, should be perceived in the context of the influence of natural and supernatural forces on their lives and the space around them. Through this lens, Vapak is understood as both a mushroom and a living entity, which plays a vital role in the lives of the Lygoravetlat. One of the Amanita products sold on the Canadian market is called Calm, an Amanita Muscaria extract produced by the company Psyched Wellness. On their website, the company mentions how they created a proprietary Amanita extract called AME1 and how this took $2 million and 2 years to produce. Its founders and directors predominantly have a finance background, and Psyched Wellness is publicly traded on the US, Canadian, and Frankfurt Stock Exchange. Calm is now also sold at Erewhon, the high-end health-focused grocery store known for its $17 smoothies. The company has classic capitalist tendencies, which can be considered neocolonial. In their 2022 paper, Christine Hauskeller et al. Take a broad understanding of coloniality, which includes not just domination of land, but also the commodification of psychedelic experiences. As a patented extract, AME1 encloses a comments. Mushrooms, which were freely available, are now processed and sold as a specific formula, of which the recipe is protected by those inside the company. This is a form of capitalist extractivism. Additionally, the production of Calm follows a commodification logic. Amanita muscaria mushrooms are treated as chemical resources, and by productizing an Amanita muscaria extract, Psyched Wellness, like many other companies selling Amanita muscaria products, commodifies the psychedelic experience. In the case of Calm, however, commodification equals annihilation, since the product is designed so that it does not make you high. The psychoactive compounds are carefully removed and in the production of AME1, so that Calm supposedly mostly helps people sleep. This brings to mind Val Plumwood's notion of hyperseparation and the dualism mentioned by Hauskeller et al. Of synthetic versus natural. This categorizes the Western modes of production as radically different from other modes of producing psychedelic substances. The biomedical approach is often, also in the case of calm, presented as safer and more focused on the cure, and therefore better, superior, and cleaner. While the indigenous way is presented through notions of animism and rituals, which are not deemed scientific. According to Hauskeller, the dualism of synthetic versus natural overlaps with the dualist distinction of reason and nature, which is deeply entrenched in the interrelated logics of enlightenment and colonization. By commodifying and neutralizing altered states, psych wellness has also stripped Amanita Muscaria of its spiritual significance and instead reframed the mushroom as a sleep aid. If we compare the indigenous and Western framings of Amanita Muscaria based on the examples outlined today, it becomes evident that Amanita Muscaria is, on the one hand, an entity with which humans have had and continue to have a profound sense of kinship. This type of relational ontology is present in many indigenous cosmologies. Think, for example, of the recent Indigenous Ayahuasca conference, where indigenous groups produced a manifesto to emphasize that ayahuasca is not merely a substance, but a profound system of knowledge tied to ancestral lands, ceremonies, and community healing. In the Western world, on the other hand, Amanita Muscaria has increasingly been turned into a product. This commodification often follows an extractivist logic, which is deeply entwined with the colonial tendencies and dualisms embedded in Western culture. Additionally, there is the colonial continuity of appropriation. When indigenous practices are referenced by Western actors, this often happens inadequately or without actual attempts at reciprocity or collaboration, while erasing indigenous meanings or profiting from indigenous plants and plant medicine practices. This ontological fracture, relational versus extractive, mirrors broader colonial patterns in the global psychedelic renaissance, as practices of commodification and medicalization continue to be reproduced and amplified. Indigenous communities who have traditionally safeguarded the knowledges and practices pertaining plant medicines still tend to be marginalized, their practices misappropriated, and their knowledge capitalized on by actors operating in a growing global market. So what would it mean to reframe Amanita Muscaria in ways that honor the relational ontology of the Lygoravetlat? How can we foreground indigenous knowledges without extraction and appropriation? This requires integrating and embodying a sense of humility and respect towards ancestral traditions, as well as the acknowledgement that our knowledge of plants and their medicinal properties has roots, and that the Western ways of knowing are not superior to the indigenous ones. It also requires the integration of a relational ethics, which acknowledges plants as living beings, not merely as containers of resources to be extracted and monetized. Additionally, resisting extractivism in psychedelic practice and scholarship includes, following historian Andrea Ens, a sense of reflexivity and a self-critical yet sympathetic introspection as researchers or business owners or medical professionals to help deconstruct our own colonizing tendencies and our positional relationship as non-indigenous practitioners to indigenous bodies of knowledge. If we are to reframe the plants and practices we are in relation with, we should, following Linda Tuhiwai Smith, give indigenous peoples more control over the way in which indigenous issues and social problems are discussed and handled. As those who have profited from them or are about to profit from indigenous practices, it is the responsibility of today's scholars, entrepreneurs, medical professionals, and therapists to enhance anti-racist decolonizing narratives, frameworks, and methodologies by engaging in reflexive thinking practices and seriously accounting for the ways in which our practices undermine and amplify decolonization. The story of Amanita Muscaria is not just a story about a colorful mushroom, it is a story about competing ways of knowing and being in the world. one relational and animistic, the other extractivist and commodifying. The two ontologies expanded on here, informed by the indigenous perspective of the Lygoravetlat and the product produced by Psyched Wellness, offer contrasting visions of relating and knowing. This ontological fracture echoes a rupture between cultures which is present in many facets of the current psychedelic renaissance. And it will need to be brought to our attention until we find sufficient ways of honoring our psychedelic roots while moving forward. Decolonizing psychedelics demands that we take perspectives of our indigenous ancestors and kin seriously as we evolve. Perhaps we can begin by recognizing beings like Vakpak not as commodities, but as companions in our storied living cosmos. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Really fascinating. We have time for a couple of questions or comments while we are waiting for people to get inspired to or encouraged to ask. I'm thinking of like what Christine said during the previous lecture about like synthetic molecules. Well, would you find the same kinds of problems with synthetic muskimol? And also with other kinds of like substances, CBD, cannabidiol, has been big business or become big business, and even though there are like lots of indigenous uses of cannabis as well, how do you perceive of this?
Yes, it's an interesting reflection, and as I was writing the paper, I noticed in myself that I have a bit of an allergy towards the synthetic compounds, because I feel that they are not from nature and ultimately more extractivist. But I found it interesting in the discussion earlier and in what Christine was also sharing, how there is of course also perhaps an environmental argument to be made for using these substances over others if the environmental impact of producing the chemical compounds is less less hard, less in general. Yeah. But that wasn't your question, was it?
Well, I also mentioned CBD, is all this cannabis business which is booming.
Of course. Yeah.
Well, that's a bit like whataboutism.
Yeah.
But do you have a perspective on that?
Whether the chemical version is...
Or about the decolonial or colonial perspective on this whole cannabis industry?
I mean, I think the cannabis industry is a whole topic in itself, of course, because I think the way that cannabis is produced is often on a very large scale, not necessarily safeguarded by indigenous actors. I think it's interesting, for me, what I find interesting is to look at it from the perspective of the plant and what we're doing to these plants in the process of creating these products. What I feel with cannabis specifically is that the way that cannabis is grown on such an industrial scale also robs the plant. Like it's not a biodiverse environment that it grows in, which affects also the properties of the cannabis. For example, a lot of cannabis is enhanced to make it stronger, to get us more high. And I think all of these interventions are not necessarily harmless, I would say, for the ecology and for the plants as such.
Yes, thank you. There, Juuso has... I will run the mic.
Thanks for the presentation. I would like to inquire and maybe ask you to be more precise, or for example criticizing the company that you mentioned and their use of Amanita. Like what exactly is the kind of ethical problem there? And I wonder, for example, with peyote and ayahuasca, I find it like much more convincing that they are substances that mostly come from very particular regions of the world, and there is like obvious harm to certain like people and culture who live there and use those plants, but then with Amanita Muscaria it grows all around the world, and then I think it's quite a strong claim that if there is some cultures that have a traditional use with it, that because of that then nobody else could have like claim to use it. And I find also like difference if you are kind of appropriating the particular practices and worldview of that culture that you mentioned and delved into, that would be like obviously like problematic. But then just the fact that, for example, if I go to forest and pick amanitas and sell them, is that in itself like ethically problematic?
Thank you for your question. I think it's a good question, and I think we have to look at what we mean by decolonization. And I think in this case, in the case of this product, colonization doesn't mean so much that they take away from one specific community, but that they commodify a psychedelic experience. And that is specifically why I quoted Christine Hauskeller on this as well, because if you take a broader understanding of colonization, then that is included in there. And I think it is about how, so for me it's more about relationality and how we relate with these substances. And the extraction and the enclosure of a commons, which is happening in this case, by creating a specific recipe that can only be sold at a very specific price to a very specific audience, is a form of capitalist extractivism, and therefore kind of perpetuates like a colonization logic, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Thank you.
A brief one, or if not, then we thank George once again. Thank you.
Thank you.